The Battle of Lincoln in 1141 was one of 3 of the only major battles fought during the period of the Anarchy. Empress Matilda and her half-brother Robert of Gloucester had established control of the southwest of England. Now there was constant siege warfare, with each side besieging and sacking towns and cities. Worcester was one of the first major settlements to be looted and burned. The current war zone started from Worcester, heading south, covering locations such as Gloucester, Wilton and Wareham. Both sides were also now planning various campaigns and raids into disputed territories, and employing several mercenaries, as most lords and barons outside the war zone were reluctant to aid King Stephen, as they were more worried about their own lands than fulfilling their oath to the king. Mercenaries would be the primary troops used during the Anarchy, and mercenaries were expensive, plus their loyalties were dubious at best, but they could be very effective in looting and raiding one's enemy's properties. In 1140, King Stephen's troops attacked one of Robert's houses in Tewkesbury, setting it ablaze. In Bath, there were reports of fighting, as one of the first commanders to die in the conflict was Geoffrey Talbot, a Norman noble. Nottingham would be the next city to be looted and burned, with a chronicler describing the chaos as, "The whole city was destroyed by the flames. Even those in churches died, as the buildings caught fire and collapsed upon them." This act would certainly strike terror into the king's other holdings. Nottingham is in the East Midlands, so King Stephen may have thought the city was too far for the Angevins to reach. But the attack showed a weakness. If Empress Matilda's forces could strike in places that King Stephen's defence was lacklustre, then they may be able to win the war. You might think that while with all this planning, attacking and warfare going on, that Empress Matilda was simply waiting in the safety of Bristol Castle. But that would be wrong to assume. We know she was an effective administrator and had considerable more experience in the matters of diplomacy and logistics than some of her male supporters. So, as she was planning on being crowned Queen of England, it should be no surprise she would handle the day-to-day running of her court and territories. Plus, she needed to act like a ruler, as England was supposed to be hers. After all, her father, King Henry, certainly made sure that his nobles knew this by having them swear oaths again and again. Empress Matilda certainly did act a ruler by creating earls and lords, a reward for their loyalty to her. After moving to Gloucester, Empress Matilda set about having her own coinage minted. This was another act of portraying who the rightful ruler was. The business of sacking cities was something everyone could agree was terrifying, especially the clergy, as church property was also being destroyed. The Bishop of Winchester, Henry, sought to end the war before more harm could come to the realm, and thanks to his position, he managed to get both sides to agree to a meeting. Both sides sent representatives. Empress Matilda sent her brother, Robert of Gloucester, and King Stephen sent his wife, Queen Matilda. The talks yielded little in the way of a compromise, as both sides wanted something the other refused to give. And if the conflict were to last for years, both sides had children that could one day take up the mantle and lead their respective sides. William of Malmesbury states that they wasted words and time to no purpose and departed without being able to conclude a peace. By December of 1140, England was divided. There would be no peace in sight unless one side was utterly defeated. A pitched battle could end the war, but for the moment, both parties were working to take each other's forts and castles, as there was less risk involved. But sometimes, a siege wasn't needed to capture a fort or castle, as the actions of others could sway a lord who owned a castle to join the opposing side, or a castle could be taken using subterfuge. In our previous episodes, we mentioned that King Stephen's actions of alienating lords and barons would come back to haunt him, and now an event would occur that would change the course of the war, as two half-brothers, Ranulph de Gernon and William de Rumère, were enraged at King Stephen. Firstly, there was the issue of the Scottish settlement, as King Stephen granted a huge portion of the north of England to David, King of the Scots, and David's son Henry. This treaty disinherited Ranulph and William to lands and titles. Another further insult the brothers suffered was over the earldom of Lincoln, as King Stephen granted the earldom to William d'Orbigny. He was a loyal supporter of the king, despite his wife Adeliza hosting Empress Matilda at Arundel. These actions angered the brothers, and to make their displeasure known, the brothers thought of a very cunning plan of sending their wives under the guise of a courtesy call to Lincoln Castle. Surely no one could object to a few noble ladies meeting each other for a Christmas gathering to exchange gifts and pleasantries. The timing of this visit was meticulous, as the ladies arrived at the castle when the garrison was spread thin around the city. Ranulph then appeared, unarmed, with 3 knights under the pretext to escort his wife and sister-in-law home. Yet, once they gained access, they unveiled hidden weapons and surprised the guards, taking control of the castle. Ranulph then opened the gates to allow his brother in with more men that were waiting nearby. An incredibly daring plan that went off without a hitch. One of the most wealthy and fortified cities in England taken right from underneath the king. The taking of the city was now the start of an open quarrel with the king, as the 2 brothers had not declared for either side at the start of the war, so we can assume that they still had pledged to King Stephen during the Easter Court of 1136. King Stephen was partaking in Christmas festivities 150 miles away in Windsor when he received the news, and as we've known from his previous actions, King Stephen leapt into motion and quickly organised his forces to march to Lincoln Castle. 3 of our sources, the deeds of King Stephen, William of Malmesbury, and Orderic Vitalis, all mention that the citizens of Lincoln wrote to the king and asked him to come to their aid. While the king was busy preparing to march, Ranulph set about fortifying his position, as he knew it could take weeks for the king to arrive, and as winter was nearly here, Ranulph may have thought the king would be hesitant to start a campaign near the winter. He was wrong. As King Stephen arrived before Christmas was over, Orderic Vitalis writes of the king's anger that may have fueled his march, as he was, quote, very angry at the news and astounded that his close friends, on whom he had heaped lands and honours, should have committed such a crime. When King Stephen arrived, the citizens of Lincoln greeted the king and invited him into the city, where he soon besieged the castle and discovered that the garrison were of a small number. The castle now under siege, Ranulph escaped, leaving his brother and his wife in the castle. Ranulph's wife was Maud of Gloucester. She was the daughter of Robert of Gloucester, and with her now trapped in the castle, Ranulph galloped to his father-in-law to ask for his aid. Perhaps leaving his wife behind was a cunning ploy to enlist Robert's help, or just a convenient motivation for Robert. Regardless, Ranulph had now sworn to the Angevin cause. Empress Matilda's ranks of the disinherited was growing, and no doubt she would be able to richly reward them after being crowned. The Angevin party quickly organised their forces in such a rapid manner, similar to how King Stephen mustered his own troops, and by February 1141 the Angevins had an army ready to march. Robert had recruited a large portion of his troops from Wales, led by Mad Dog ap Meredith and Cadwallader ap Griffith. With the Angevins on the move, King Stephen's forces were battering the gates with all manner of siege weapons. The small garrison wouldn't be able to hold out for long. King Stephen's army itself wasn't huge, roughly about 1,000 men, but it was large enough to take the castle. Robert's relief army was slightly bigger. Both sides consisted of mounted knights, a wrecking ball on the battlefield if deployed properly, equipped with lances and swords. King Stephen did receive news that Robert was on his way with a sizable army to challenge him, but King Stephen decided to remain and carry on with the siege. Now, we need to understand why King Stephen chose to remain, despite the advice given to him by his earls to retreat. King Stephen may have felt that continuing with the siege was the most important action. After all, he came at the request of the citizens of the city, and leaving them now could become a moral victory for the defenders of the castle. Secondly, perhaps the king may have been blinded by rage, as losing such a rich and prosperous city would become a major setback. Or maybe, if he could win the upcoming battle and capture all the lords that rebelled against him, then this war could be closer to ending, as Empress Matilda would be the last one to capture. One source, The Deeds of King Stephen, writes of his decision. He refused to sully his fame by disgrace of flight, but boldly went to meet them outside the town. So now King Stephen would be caught between his enemies, the garrison from Lincoln Castle and the approaching Angevin army, which would arrive at the west side of the city. The recent wet weather had made the surrounding area damp and marshy, so the Angevin army had to cross a ford to reach the plains near the city, making them easy to spot from the castle walls. William of Malmesbury states that the river had swollen and the Angevins had to swim across. It's doubtful they swam across, as we know crossing a river in heavy armour will mean you'll sink like a stone. King Stephen's forces did try and stop the Angevins from crossing the river, but they were soon pushed back. King Stephen then led his army out of the city to deploy just outside the city walls. While both armies were preparing for battle, King Stephen asked Baldwin Fitzgilbert to give a rallying speech, as according to Henry of Huntingdon, King Stephen was not good at making speeches, lacking a witty tongue. Another source suggests that the king's voice was weak. Over on the Angevin side, several speeches were made, one by Ranulph and then by Robert. Robert states that they must remember that he was the son of the old King Henry, and Empress Matilda was the rightful heir to the throne. He then made an earnest request to the army that they rely on God's courage. With the speeches over, the final preparations were made. King Stephen had some of his knights dismounted to fight on foot in the centre, as he didn't have as much cavalry to deploy as the Angevins. William of Ypres commanded the left, and on the right were several earls of Northampton, Richmond, York and Worcester. On the Angevin side, Robert led the centre with Ranulph on the right with Welsh infantry, and Miles of Gloucester on the left, also with Welsh infantry. 3 divisions on both sides, the battle begins with William of Ypres charging into the Welsh on the left. While Robert attacked King Stephen in the centre, almost immediately the Welsh troops were routed by William. But now Ranulph's cavalry behind the Welsh now charged at William, while the Angevin left wing attacked King Stephen's right wing. One account of the battle now states that William fled the field before coming into close quarters. The suggestion of an archery attack is the given reason for William fleeing, as the routing of the Welsh may have disorganised their formation. With William now fleeing the battle, King Stephen's wings collapsed as the earls abandoned the king, as after seeing the Angevin cavalry fighting with swords instead of lances, the possibility of dying rather than being captured and ransomed was a possible reason for the earls' flight from the field. The king was now surrounded on all sides, but refused to give up. As the king fought, inflicting wounds from his terrible arm, his weapon broke and he was given a Norse axe, fighting on until the axe also broke. The king's rampage was only stopped after he suffered a blow to the head from a rock being thrown. The king, now dazed, was soon captured. The battle was over and King Stephen of England was now a prisoner.